In this lesson, I'm going to talk about the way the school teaches. And as you can see, most of the time, you can see the picture, most of the time, a student seems to be a little bit bored. These are the subjects I'm going to talk about in this lesson. First of all, how do we know how school teaches? Secondly, I will go to the concept of banking education. Then I will go to the question of the hidden curriculum. Finally, as an alternative, I will be speaking about active learning. It is particularly difficult to know how our schools are actually teaching. On the one hand, we have schools with strong, consensus-based educational projects. These are schools where it is relatively easy for anyone interested to find out how they teach. For example, one of the most renowned democratic schools, Central Park East School in New York City, has an office that welcomes visitors to the school and invites them to walk around it, usually accompanied by several pupils or a teacher. The classroom doors are open, which facilitates observation. But on the other hand, there are some schools, maybe the majority of them, in which this observation is not possible and where each teacher may well have his or her own teaching style, which may well be the opposite of that of the colleague in the next classroom or of the teacher in the next class in the same group. So, how can we possibly know anything about how classrooms work? One can resort to quantitative methods based on surveys of students, as we will see in some edition of the OECD PISA report. There is also the possibility of doing qualitative research by observing classrooms while teaching. There are several problems with this type of research. The first, and perhaps fundamental, is that the fact that a teacher feels observed may change his or her behavior, similar to Heisenberg's indeterminacy principle. This is what can happen when schools are visited on the basis of authorization from the education administration, as well as we see in a report by OECD PISA in the Canary Islands. This problem does not exist, as you can see in the picture, in some Shanghai classrooms, as they have an observation room attached to the classroom with a mirror similar to those in police station interrogation rooms, so that those in the classroom do not know whether they are being observed or not. This teacher discomfort can be overcome in ethnographic research when the researcher spends long periods of time in the school and is able to create an atmosphere of trust. What is clear is that this requires the acquiescence of the teachers concerned. Typically, the teachers who agree to be observed are those who are the most innovative or confident about the teaching, which would lead to a serious bias in the research. Obviously, the great advantage of qualitative research is to observe more directly what happens in the classrooms, observation that can be complemented by interviews or by informal conversations with teachers. As I said at the beginning, one of the OECD PISA reports looked at how school teaches. This was the case for OECD PISA 2012. It focused on the teaching of mathematics. In this report, students were asked about their learning strategies in this subject. To find out their strategies, a series of questions were grouped into 4 blocks with 3 options in each, so that only one of these options could be selected, a limitation that can be considered more than debatable. In each of the blocks, the first options correspond to what PISA calls a control strategy. It is intended to measure the degree to which the student reflects on what he or she has learned. The second measures elaboration strategies, which refer to whether students relate their real-life experiences to what they have learned. And finally, the third measures memorization strategies. And here you can see the results. I'm simply reading the content of the slide. With the exception of the first block, Spain is a country in which its students have a greater tendency to rely on rote learning than the average in OECD countries. Secondly, Spain is the country in which students make least use of control strategies. All this leads towards performance, but it does not end there. There are great differences in the use of memorization between the lower, middle and upper social classes, constructed from the PISA Socioeconomic and Cultural Index. And finally, what was found was conclusive. Lower class students resort to memorization to a much greater extent than the rest. Here you have a table that summarizes the reading or the text attached to this lesson. This is the ethnographic work by Jean Ainion. In the first column you have the 5 schools analyzed by her: 2 working class schools, a middle class, a professional affluent, and a top executives. In the second column you have the main issue, the main topic that teachers consider that is the main feature of these schools. In the working class schools, the main theme is the question of discipline. In the middle class, to understand what the students read. In the professional affluent, is to promote the individual creativity. And in the last one is to learn how to think by themselves. And then you have what are the main teaching strategy in maths and social sciences in these different schools, and finally what the pupils think about what is the origin of the knowledge from teachers and textbooks in the case of working class schools and middle class schools, and in the case of professional affluent from what you think, you read, but also from teachers and from textbooks. Well, previously you have watched a short video, 4 minutes video, in which the concept of banking education is explained. This concept comes from the theories, from the interpretation of the Brazilian pedagogist Paulo Freire. Our education system is based on the premise that the teacher must perform the almost impossible task of being able to constantly attract and hold the attention of the pupils. To do so, the school forces the students to remain quiet and seated. In this sense, the French sociologist Émile Durkheim already pointed out that for idealist thought, the teacher's role would consist only of teaching, ignoring the evidence of asymmetry characteristic of all kinds of pedagogical or educational relations, which are of ideological domination. The educational system, it goes so far as to say, is an instrument of domination of souls, of imposing the legitimacy of a particular culture or way of life. The situation of dispossession of students' power is so big that Durkheim goes so far as to compare the educational relationship to hypnosis. In fact, the teacher of the textbook could say outrageous things. This is the power of the school and the teacher. Education does not bring about a process of natural development, but of creation, of production. This creation cannot be natural, rather it is social and therefore inharmonic. Here I present the case of a secondary school in Madrid. You can see there a picture of this high school, and this is what is in the web page of this high school, and these are the main complaints of the teachers of this school. So the teachers find serious deficiencies that affect 90% of students. They complain about poor time planning, mainly procrastination, lack of an adequate, systematic and active study method based on the understanding of what one wants to learn. Most pupils study in an archaic, rote and repetitive way, so the study is very boring and ineffective, which increases their insecurity and dissatisfaction. For the exam preparation, students memorize, study the day before the exam. It would be more correct to review the notes previously understood. About reading, it is easier for them to memorize something mechanically than to make an effort to extract the main ideas and understand the content of what has been read, the basis for the subsequent use of comprehensive memory. And about note-taking, they tend to copy everything they can from what the teacher says without thinking whether they understand it or not. Approximately 20% of students have a negative attitude towards studies, subject, teachers, school. There is a clear lack of motivation. And here you can see what a group of observers from OECD mentioned in a visit they made to some schools in the Canary Islands, which is quite clear contrast with the teachers in the previous high school I mentioned. So they said that the teaching style of many secondary teachers is still to stand at the front of the class, the banking education, and deliver knowledge content to students, rarely checking whether students understand the meaning of what they are being taught or how to apply it. Some old-style teachers only require students to memorize what has been delivered to succeed in their tests. This teaching style is not conducive to good results in OECD PISA or good education more widely. Things get worse in the baccalaureate, which is permanently threatened by the sword of Damocles of the university entrance exam and the no less oppressive need to obtain excellent marks both in this exam and in the baccalaureate in order to be able to take those university degrees in which the demand exceeds the supply of vacancies. This is what a secondary school teacher said about the baccalaureate. As it is now, it is a course where you don't educate the students, you train them. Under these conditions, a good student, one of those who appear in the press because of their galactic marks in the baccalaureate and university entrance exam, could be fundamentally an expert in how to deal with the peculiarities of each teacher, and quite possibly someone who has a certain degree of passion for some subjects. From a very interesting book on cognitive sciences, I take this paragraph. Invariably, people who are successful in school are good at figuring out what the teacher wants and giving it to him or her. In real life, there is no teacher to please, and these great hunters often find themselves disoriented. When I've been in charge of graduate admissions, if students presented a record that was all honors and outstanding, I immediately rejected it. It is not possible for someone to be equally good or equally interested in everything except pleasing the professor. And the anthropologist Susan Bloom makes a similar point. Our education takes people away from the flow of life, forcing them to please teacher, emphasizing individual cognitive mastery of isolated pieces of knowledge. Then you are going to see a short interview with Susan Bloom. And here you have one of the sheets of the exam, of the university entrance exam for the subject of history. And as you can see, if you stop the presentation, you can see that most of the time is simply about memorizing facts and simply answer what the textbook of the teacher has said in the classroom in the high school. So take a time to read the questions. Whenever one speaks of the first, or at least the first ethnographic book in education, reference to Philip Jackson is unavoidable. Jackson came to qualitative research as a result of disenchantment with the limitation of his numerous psychological studies of educational measurement. By chance, he came into contact with primate research where it was clear that the behavior of these animals differed markedly in laboratory situations compared with the life in the wild. From here, he extrapolated the hypothesis to the school environment. Students will show very different behaviors in test situations compared to the everyday classroom life. From here, and without further theoretical tools, and this is one of the Jackson's great limitations, he launched himself into the black box, into the classroom, to analyze the process that take place inside it. In any case, the work of going into the classroom with no other purpose than to observe what life is like for students and teachers in the natural environment, that is, the classroom, is praiseworthy and courageous. It is an effort that moves away from the omnipresent canons of positivism. This time, it is not a question of approaching reality once the questions to be answered have been posed, but an effort to interpret reality, where prior questions do not become a rigid straitjacket that prevents the scientist from perceiving elements not foreseen in the research design. The easiness of this type of research is only apparent, as Jackson rightly points out. The familiar and the ordinary are the main barriers to be penetrated. Here we have the first empirical formulation of the so-called hidden curriculum, the unintended effects of school instructions. Pupils are compelled to spend a large number of hours in an enclosed space, which turns the school into a total institution where virtually every aspect of their lives is controlled. There is a clear inequality in the distribution of power, which is concentrated in the hands of the teacher, who is not the only one to make judgments about pupils. Other pupils can also do so, but is the only person authorized to evaluate. As Talcott Parsons detected, the teachers reward students who are good, understanding by good those who obey the teacher, to the extent that the teacher tends to reprimand bad behavior in the classroom to a much greater extent than ignorance. This is as far as Jackson goes. He does not outline any kind of theory or even an explanation as to why this is so, why many pupils consider school irrelevant, why the teacher has to keep order in the classroom. The reader is left with the impression that this is the way because the life is like this, because the school must work this way, and this could be worse because teachers work better this way. Jackson's made no structural connection between the world in the classroom and the life outside the classroom. He finds no link between social relations inside the classroom and social relations in the sphere of production, patriarchal family life, or the particular or the political organization of society. The asymmetrical power relations in which students and teachers are involved has been emphasized from the very beginning of the sociological study of education. As we have seen, Bowles and Gintis, who are economists, consider that students live in a context of alienation similar to that of workers in their jobs. The education system integrates individuals into corresponding jobs, not through the conscious intentions of teachers, or if you like, the education system, but through a close correspondence between the social relations that govern interactions in the workplace and the social relations of the education system. This correspondence has these four main aspects. You can read easily in this slide, and then after reading this slide you will have a very short video in which the theory of correspondence of Bowles and Gintis is explained. Here you have more stuff about the connection or the hidden curriculum between the connection, in this case, between social class and school. And this is taken from this book whose title is Class Rules. So here the author considers that the curricula for the children of the wealthy are enriched and demanding. The curricula for the children of the working class and poor are minimal and boring. The children of the wealthy learn to use complex and heavy class-coded language, while other children learn a stripped-down style of communication, often based on popular media. Curricula contain explicit and implicit social codes. Here you have some questions that you may propose to yourself. to yourself, whether you are a maker of history or simply an observer, whether the history of Western civilization is your history or the history of white privilege, is the story made by men and not women, do I learn the fundamental skills of higher order thinking, or do I fill out worksheets every day? Is my linguistic code complex and imaginative? Am I confident on my abilities, or am I insecure? I am sure of my worth. And most important for this study, am I empowered or disempowered as an active social actor? And now we have the alternative to this passive learning. So the active learning will rely basically on competencies. Competencies are based in the ability to solve real problems, to know how to use them what you have to use what you have learned in new situations. So here you have a reflection for the former head of human relations in Google. So the way schools work, the subjects it teaches are forgotten easily, and students rarely incorporate them into their interpretative schemes of reality. There is no doubt that we should do things differently. It would be preferable for students to work on multidisciplinary projects or centers of interest so that they integrate skills and content from different curricular areas into a specific problem. The option, it seems clear, should be the complex and exciting task of providing people with the tools to be able to search for, select, and create knowledge for themselves. In other words, we should move towards an educational scenario in which learning is engaging, connected to personal development, and allows individuals to be freer, more caring, more creative. Competency-based learning is a golden opportunity to rethink the meaning of education, what can be expected of a person who spends a minimum of 10 years in school, what is essential to have acquired after those 10 years to enable people to function fluently as workers, as citizens, as members of family, as members of a community. The idea of competence refers to the fact that mere knowledge is not enough, even if it is the inevitable starting point. Acquiring the linguistic competence to write, for example, is not just a matter of knowing the rules of grammar, conjugating verbs, and doing exercises. It requires something else. Knowing how to write requires being able to organize ideas, to structure them, to connect one paragraph with another, to have an overview of what you want to say, to search for and contrast information, acquire a rich and varied vocabulary. We can say that the person is competent when he or she can solve real problems which are always complex. As early as the 1970s, McClellan explained that academic records do not provide sufficient information to predict reliability, the suitability of people for different jobs, not to know their possible career path. Despite the novelty of the discourse on competencies, the reflection on learning for life is rooted in a whole pedagogical tradition of more than a century of existence. Freinet, John Dewey, and others, we are talking about something like Piaget's cognitive conflict, that situation in which previously acquired knowledge is not sufficient to find an answer and there is no choice but to seek new solutions. In short, learning by competencies means insisting on the ability to face real problems and find a satisfactory solution. Now you are going to watch a video in which this question of learning by competencies is being made in the case of Singapore. Well, the conclusions for this lesson would be that our schools still seem to teach in the same way as they did decades ago or enough centuries ago. We know that this way of teaching is not the most effective. Nevertheless, the inertias of the past are imposing themselves on the present. However, it is possible to teach in a different way as is done in some higher school and in some countries. Probably we'll see more of these things when talking about democratic schools in, I think, lesson 8.